Hello, welcome to She Became Visible. It is Monday, which means, as I introduced last week, my new format, I'm going to start doing different topics under my She Became Visible moniker so that you know what we're going to be talking about, because becoming visible as a woman in not only the world, but also in the eyes of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, otherwise known as Mormonism, why it is so distorted, and actually the women are gaslit into thinking that they have power, that they have authority, that they have value. But underneath it all, there is the truth. And so on Mondays, we're going to be talking about Mormonism. Hence, I call it Mormon Monday. Again, just to remind you, on Wednesdays, which I am titling Wisdom Wednesdays, we will have a guest and we will cover a lot of different subjects. And I'm afraid there will be a little bit of Mormonism thrown in there on Wednesdays because of what the world is going through right now. And you cannot separate the church and the world, because the Mormon church is quite extensively part of the American history story, and it plays a huge part, and we're going to talk about that. On Fridays, we are going to dedicate it. It's called Fitness Friday, and we're going to talk about health and longevity, and specifically and only we will be talking about women's health. But today it's Monday, so we're going to be continuing our Mormon Monday. So let me start out by giving you just a few previews of coming attractions.
How rich is the church? Some estimates have them at over $200 billion. The church receives, certainly at that time, they receive, I think, about $7 billion of tithing revenue a year, because every member of the church gives 10% of their gross income to the church. And the church is receiving about $7 billion in donations a year. They own 2% of the landmass of Florida. They own loads of land as well, real estate sort of empire. They just bought down the road in Wembley, they bought a $100 million, 129 million pound or dollar Amazon warehouse that they just keep renting out to Amazon. They're doing well for themselves.
I love Nemo. And if you don't know who he is, and you probably don't if you're not part of the Mormon community, Nemo is a young man that lives in England, and he was recently excommunicated. As a faithful member, he highlighted on his podcasts and YouTubes the fraud and deception that was going on in the church. And so, because of that, and he wasn't saying, you should leave this evil church. He just was saying, do better. I want my church to do better. And so he brought out these inconsistencies of truth. And because of that, he was excommunicated. He's only like 29, but he's so brilliant and he really has a lot of information. But what I'm talking about today is, if you are not familiar with the Mormon church, or if your only familiarity with the church is that they believe in polygamy, oh no, it's so much more. And you need to be aware. Now, like Nemo just said, how many other religions do you know that have $100 billion or $100 million rather, to buy an Amazon warehouse in England and do nothing with it but rent it back to Amazon? So it is literally an investment, a monetary investment. A lot of times right now, when you see, because of the Christian nationalist movement, when you see the criticisms of religion, or the money that's being taken in, you will see that as it relates to the richness of the member or the head of that Christian denomination. If it's a evangelical or Protestant or Catholic or whatever, they will compare the money to what the diocese is doing or what the congregation is doing. In the example of Copeland, it shows his mansions, his airplanes. And that's what makes the Mormon church so different, because they are the wealthiest church in the world per capita. And I know that many of you right now are going, no, that's not true. It's got to be the Catholic Church. But you don't understand that the Catholic Church, each individual diocese is its own individual entity. So, for example, if you were in Michigan and there was a Catholic church there, and there was some abuse of some kind, and you wanted to sue, you would sue that diocese only, the Michigan diocese. But the way the Mormon church is set up is everything flows back to the corporation that is held in Salt Lake City. So if there is a lawsuit brought against the church, it goes back to the church as a whole in Salt Lake City. And so all of the money that is taken in is immediately sent to Salt Lake and then distributed as the heads of the corporation see fit. You know, you won't have a diocese in Illinois or Ohio or Alabama that can be sued separately. You are suing a large corporation that has control over the money. They are not only the wealthiest church in the world, they are also the largest private owner of land, private land ownership in the United States. And they own more private land than all other corporations in the United States. Why is the big question. And what are they doing with that wealth? So what we're going to do today is I want to start out with another Mormon apologist, Sharon Eubanks, but she specifically is talking about the wealth in the Mormon church. And when people criticize the Mormon church and they say, you know, what are you guys doing with all those billions of dollars? I believe it's at this point, and I don't know when Nemo made that video, but at this point in 2025, I believe it's over $250 billion. And I just recently saw an article on how AI, their investments, the church's investments in AI has brought them to like $4 billion. And then they go on their lectures and in their speaking, their gaslighting, they tell the members of the church, you know, we should be really careful of AI. I mean, AI is really dangerous. So that's the hypocrisy. It's mind blowing. So let me start out by showing you a little clip of Sharon Eubanks explaining why the Mormon church, even though it's the wealthiest church in the world, is not obligated to help the poor.
I'm occasionally asked,
there we go.
Why doesn't the church spend more money on humanitarian work? Why don't we stop building expensive temples and focus the resources on relieving poor people? That's a legitimate question to ask the Church of Jesus Christ. But is it money that solves society's ills? I will never discount the one thing that this church does that lifts entire communities in rapid development, because it invites men and women of all social classes and all backgrounds to enter into a sacred building and make the most binding, important promises of their mortal lives. In those buildings, they promise not to steal or lie. They promise to be faithful to their spouse and their children. They vow that they'll seek the interest of their neighbor and be peacemakers and become devoted to that idea that we're all one family. We're all valued and alike unto God. And if those promises made in holy temples are kept, it transforms society faster than any aid, any development project ever could. The greatest charitable development project on the planet is for people themselves to bind themselves to God and mean it.
On Wisdom Wednesday, my guest is going to be, my co-host will be Megan Connor, and our guest on that day is Tim Kosnoff, who is an expert in the abuse that is currently going on in the Mormon church. This idea that if you go to the temple and you take upon yourself covenants with God that you will not cheat on your spouse, you will not sexually abuse your children, you will not lie on your taxes, you will not steal money from your neighbors or property or whatever 10 commandment you want to throw out there, is a false visual. And the problem is, it's so indoctrinated that members of the church believe, just like Sharon Eubanks just pointed out, that if you are a member of the church in good standing, which would mean you hold a temple recommend, which means that you are paying 10% of your gross income to the Mormon church, that you're not cheating on your wife, that you're not lying on your taxes, that you're obeying the word of wisdom, which means you're not drinking alcohol or coffee or tea or smoking. And if you have a temple recommend, you're not doing any of those things. So if I hire you as an electrician in my home, I don't have to worry about you being honest and working hard and giving me a reasonable quote and really working to correct my electrical issues, the reason I hired you, because you're a temple recommend holder. Now, I know this from personal experience. My parents, years ago, wanted to purchase a place where they could retire. And they wanted to purchase a place in the Pacific Northwest. So even though they were living in, I can't remember if they were in Missouri or California at the time, they went to Oregon. They found a faithful member of the church who had private property. He was a developer and he had some property to sell. And so, because he was a member, my parents believed that he could be trusted. And so they bought some property from him that they thought would be their forever home. They thought this would be the place that they would retire. And I remember sitting in the back of the car with my mother. My father and this particular real estate agent, they were sitting in the front of the car. And I remember him telling my parents that there was a little bit of a well issue on this property and that it was no problem, yada, yada, yada. And I remember going, doo 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 doo, red flags, alarm, alarm. And my parents just believed him. So they buy the house. They took their long invested savings, which was all they had. They were living on my dad's pension, which they know people don't have anymore, and his Social Security, which he was getting from his work in the United States. And also, he was a former English citizen. And so he was receiving money from England, from his family and his father's work that they had done, or whatever, however that system works. That's what they were living on. He had no income. So whatever savings they had, whatever equity they had built up in their home, that was all the money they had. So they took this money, they invested it in this house. Once that house closed, lo and behold, they didn't have any water. And it cost them thousands to try and get a well dug. In the end, they sold the home. They lost a ton of money on this because this man was a lying piece of crap. And he took advantage of older people. And this is what happens when Mormons believe that just because you show up at church every Sunday or you are a temple recommend holder, that you have to be honest. So this is the kind of BS that the church touts. And they also use this as an excuse because right now, membership in the church in the United States of America is down. In fact, I believe it's down in all of the Western civilizations, but it's booming in Africa because this teaching that Sharon Eubanks is teaching is telling the African citizens, your poverty, your tribal wars, your raping of your young women, your misogynist treatments of women in general will all go away if you just join the Mormon church and start giving the church 10% of your income. Even though you're starving to death and extremely poor, you still need to pay that money because that is proof that you are a servant of God. And then they're building temples in Africa. They're encouraging these people to go to the temple, and that is what's going to pull them out of poverty. It is mind-blowing. So that is one of the reasons why, as a former member of the Mormon Church, a church that I was indoctrinated in, that I was naive to, that I didn't understand or believe when other people would talk about how it's a cult or any of the other accusations that are made against the church. I didn't believe it. I trusted my Mormon authorities. I feel it my duty to alarm others or to at least plant a seed that will encourage more research on your part. So starting out with Nemo and Sharon Eubanks, we're going to talk about the history of Mormonism and why you need to be alarmed, because it's not just the wealth of the Mormon Church, it's the power that the Mormon Church holds today. If you think Christian nationalism is an issue, believe me, this church that claims to be a Christian organization is the one in charge. And the reason why they are throwing a lot of their Mormon teachings away and adopting more Christian beliefs is another tool that they're using to not overtake over the world. And I don't say that just in some kind of a weird metaphor. It literally is a plan to take over the world. But because they have so much money, they are able to do what other Christian organizations cannot. So they want the other Christian organizations to join them, accept them, and then they're like, we're your daddy. Okay. I want to introduce to you my favorite historian in the entire world. Dr. Benjamin Park is brilliant. And he is, you need to go and find him on YouTube because he is a historian that is telling the truth about the Mormon church. And he breaks it out into different segments. He has different subjects weekly on Monday, on Wednesday, on Friday, or whatever. He will talk about something different, but it is all about the history of the Mormon church. And in this particular one, this YouTube that he's doing is called Mormonism versus America. So I'm going to introduce you to Dr. Benjamin Park, and I'm going to let him explain to you why you should be terrified of the power that the Mormon church has. So let me bring Dr. Ben Parks on.
How did Brigham Young and the Mormons in territorial Utah, and especially their practice of polygamy, fit within the broader context of American politics and empire during the mid-19th century? This is my second video in a weekly series I'm doing on Mormonism and American politics. Expressions of this dualistic and competing contradictory impulse was when they raised the Mormon Battalion in order to send Mormon troops as part of the US-Mexican War, the first and only time there was a faith-based regiment in American military history, by the way.
So what he's talking about is a time in Mormon history when, after the pioneers left Nauvoo and went out to Utah, they were struggling. And they were starving, and it was a mess. And so financially, because of the Mexican War, if I believe, I might rewind it a little bit, just to make sure I get my facts straight. They found that if they sent a group of men to fight the Mexican War, then they would be able to get money. And they instructed their soldiers to return that money and give it back to the church.
Deliberations, one Mormon apostle described the United States as a dying carcass that they needed to flee in order to avoid the stench. That's how far their revulsion for a nation that failed them went. Joseph Smith was killed in June of 1844, and the Latter-day Saints were once again being forced to migrate from their home. They had given up on the American experiment. They believed that the United States was a failed nation, unwilling or unable to protect the rights of marginalized groups like the Latter-day Saints. So when Brigham Young was leading a large group of Mormons out west to what was then the northern Mexico territory, they were saying so long to the United States. At one point in their private deliberations, one Mormon apostle described the United States as a dying carcass that they needed to flee in order to avoid the stench. That's how far their revulsion for a nation that failed them went.
Okay, so the reason I want to highlight this is because it is a complete gaslit, indoctrinated changing of history that the Mormons believe that they left Nauvoo in search of religious freedom. But the reality is they left Nauvoo in search of a theocracy that they could control and a land that they could take over, and they wanted to leave the United States. Now this, and Ben goes into this, please go watch everything he's done. He goes into the details on how the Mormon church wanted to create this theocracy. They purposely went to a Mexican territory outside of the United States, thinking that they could take over, they could have their own country and their own land, that Brigham Young could be the power and authority over. And so that's one of the things that Ben points out. But if you were to ask a Mormon, in fact, every July 24th, they celebrate in Utah what they call Pioneer Day. And it's a celebration of the pioneers that left Nauvoo and came to Utah. Blah, blah, blah. And they have American flags, and everybody's like, yay, America, we love America. And look what Mormons do to celebrate America. And that was all instituted after they were forced to give up polygamy and could actually become a state. And so they're like, look, this we left the United States and we want a succession plan. That we need to get rid of that. And so we are going to start telling people and teaching our people that that wasn't really the truth, but we have the truth now, and we're going to go ahead. Anyway,
things changed while they were on the trail westward. The commencement of the U.S.-Mexico War, when the United States invaded Mexico to take more southwestern property in order to expand their slave territories, meant that the Mormons, like everyone else, recognized that that land they were moving to was now going to be part of the United States once again. And so they had to get over their exit of the United States and try to position themselves within a broadening American expanding empire.
This is how the church has worked. They claim to receive revelations from God telling them what to do, but the truth is they go by social construct. There are laws of the land. They do live in the United States of America. And so when laws legally change, they will have to change their church doctrine, and they claim that this change came from God. And so this is exactly what happened. All of a sudden, the United States is trying to buy Mexican territory. And so it's like, crud. Our plan to take over the world and create our own country with Brigham Young as the head is not working. So we're going to have to start changing our ideas, and we're going to start telling people something different. So that's what Ben's talking about.
Was when they raised the Mormon Battalion in order to send Mormon troops as part of the U.S.-Mexican War, the first and only time there was a faith-based regiment in American military history, by the way. Those men marched primarily to bring in goods and money to the Mormons when they solely needed it on the trek, as well as to build kinder relations with the United States now that they were going to work with them. But they weren't fully convinced that they wanted to fight on behalf of America. So the flag that they waved as part of the Mormon Battalion was a flag that featured the 13 American stars rather than the 30 some odd stars that America had at the flag at the time, representing that they were pledging allegiance to the original American iteration as it was founding, not its current iteration.
Does that sound familiar? Is that resonating with you? I mean, you could take Brigham Young and our current president and just interchange their heads. It's just amazing. The same idea. Now, granted, you have to realize the origination of the Mormon Church was not that long. I believe someone said it was like a generation away from the Revolutionary War. So you still had people that they have relatives. My dad, that my dad fought the Revolutionary War. They looked at the new United States as a practice, like, let's try this little thing out for a little bit, and it's not working. So we're going to have to go back. We're going to have to change, which is exactly what's going on in America right now. And that's why I'm saying, if you want to know why the Utah is primarily Republican, but why the legislation, the senators, the congressmen, the mayors, blah, 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 in Utah are so right-wing Republican, it's because they believe the same extreme right-wing beliefs today as they did back then. So that's why I'm comparing and encouraging you to understand this is not just a Christian organization. This is a take over the world organization, which is why when people say you can leave the church, but you can't leave it alone, it's because this is not a church. This is a corporation with more money than God and more power in our Senate and in our United States Congress than any other religion, and they have plans. So it's extremely different and important to know.
Brigham Young and the Mormons arrived to the Great Basin regions and declared themselves the colonizers, the settlers of it. They immediately pivoted. They at first wanted to establish their own theocratic empire that would be loosely under the banner of Mexico. Now they wanted to fit within the American empire, knowing the expansion coming with the U.S.-Mexico War. So they pitched a new state, the state of Deseret, with very audacious boundaries. Here is a map of what they propose the state of Deseret to look like.
This is what Brigham Young proposed to the United States when they realized, okay, crud, we're going to have to work with this system. So they're like, okay, fine. It's not a territory. We're not going to be able to take over this land, but so we will become a state. If you want us to become a state, we will. And this is the state this is the territory that we want to incorporate and make the state of Deseret. Look at this landmass and then compare that to how I introduced this podcast about the number of private land that is currently owned by this corporation. Compare it to what they wanted 200 years ago, a little over 200 years ago. The plan to take over is still enforced. So look at this.
Utah, Nevada, portions of Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, all the way to San Bernardino, Southern California, because you got to get that South Carolina beach property. In reality, they wanted the access to the trade and the ships, which of course makes sense. They also learn from their previous experiences, because in Missouri, in Illinois, they believe the states failed to protect them. And when they petitioned the federal government to intervene, the federal government responded by saying that's a states' rights issue. We do not believe the federal government should infringe on those state powers. Joseph Smith had argued, well, the federal government needs to become more powerful, making the same type of arguments that have eventually become adopted by the Republican Party during the Reconstruction era of America and the Reconstruction amendments like the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment that argue that the federal government should be interested and powerful to intervene to protect the rights of marginalized citizens.
I want you to compare what he just said and all of the other Republican beliefs that were taken on in the 19th century and how that completely correlates with what's going on today. Now, if you compare what supposedly the Republican Party stands for, Ronald Reagan's, we need a smaller government. We don't want the federal government to be, we want each state to have more power. In fact, when Roe versus Wade was completely abolished, the argument that I heard from, Donald Trump supporters was it should not be a federal thing. The government should not get involved. Each state should be able to have its own rules. And this was a Republican thing. I remember it specifically in my lifetime as a Ronald Reagan thing. We need to get government out of our lives, get government out of our schools. And the reason is because they don't want freedom. They want what they're doing now is they're claiming that they're giving states individual power, but what they're actually doing is taking more federal power. It's such a 1984 doublespeak. It's just amazing.
But now that Mormons see a new path to autonomy, they shift their political ideology. Instead of calling for more federal intervention, they say, we want one of those strong states that you previously said you could not curtail. So they petitioned for Deseret to become a state so that they could govern themselves.
If you want to know more about Mormonism and how it affects you as a non-Mormon, I want you, and also as a woman, because of the horrible misogyny that's going on out in our government right now, please like and subscribe to my channel. I think that as a woman, especially women in my demographics, I don't get a lot of the misogyny. Oh, well, not the misogyny. Hello, I was a Mormon. But the the age discrimination, I don't get that as much as I hear it from other people, but I am becoming more aware of it on little things. Like, for example, this little side topic, but for example, I was watching, just, scrolling, and there was an ad that popped up, a TikTok ad that popped up. And it was for a suitcase that you could pile a bunch of clothes in. And the advertisement, the hook for this particular suitcase was that if you are over the age of 60, you probably cannot travel independently. You probably have to have someone come with you and assist you. Therefore, you should buy this suitcase. 60 people. Blech. That's the kind of stuff I'm talking about. So what I'm saying is, please like and subscribe, because women, especially over a certain age, get ready, sis. It's coming. Okay. Push that little notification bell, because you are going to want to be, and you can choose, scroll past if this topic that I have is not something you're interested in that day, but at least you'll know that it's there.
I connect history and the past to the present on Wednesday, and on Fridays I talk more about the historiographical world that produces the works that can allow you too to become an expert. All right, let's get back to the history. What made the Mormon appeals to create a new Deseret state in the Western Territory so poignant was that this was a moment in American history where the Western Territories were the most important topic in national politics aside from slavery. This was a time, 1850, when the United States possessed more lands in these territories, these unorganized territories, than they did in organized states. And how to control those Western territories was going to be a crucial question for the nation going forward. In fact, in 1850, just a couple of years after the Mormons arrive in the Utah Territory, the Congress comes to a very contested and divisive piece of legislation known as the Compromise of 1850, which was actually a collection of 5 different major pieces of legislation that included granting territories like Utah and Arizona the ability for popular sovereignty. And that term popular sovereignty is key. That's why it's crucial for this discussion. It was popularized by a senator from Illinois, Stephen A. Douglas, known as the Little Giant for both his minuscule physical frame, but his audacious political vision.
And one of the reasons why the Mormons were kicked out of Missouri and fled to Illinois was that they would flip-flop on their backing. They would, the people who were running for office, just like what's going on today, they found that the Mormons voted in a block. They basically did what Joseph Smith told them to do. Vote this way, go for this, do this, and so because they believed that he was receiving direct guidance from God, they did everything he told them to do. And so they would vote as a block. And the politicians looked at this as like, oh, that's a lot of people. We got to get those people on our side. And so they would say, everybody, let's follow this guy. And then that guy wouldn't support the Mormon church or do what Joseph Smith wanted him to do. The guy, never mind, follow the next guy. And so that's what happened. And that's why a lot of the government started to not trust them. And that's so when they went to Washington and said, you need to help us, we're getting mobbed and there's bad things happening to us in Missouri. They're like, yeah, we're not, well, you guys are on your own. We can't support you on this.
Popular sovereignty, meaning that the people out in the West should be able to have a voice in determining how their territories should be governed. In other words, the bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. should not dictate how these territories should operate. They should be able to govern themselves. You can see why this argument would be so attractive to the Latter-day Saints. That's what they've been calling for all this time, an ability to govern themselves. And they hope they might have a colleague in this battle, because Stephen A. Douglas had previously worked with Joseph Smith in Illinois. Stephen A. Douglas was an aspiring Democratic politician at the time and then a judge who often worked with the Mormons. In fact, he granted Joseph Smith one of his writs of habeas corpus, a topic I discussed in a previous video. But now Stephen A. Douglas recognized the limits of his popular sovereignty argument, because no one in America outside of the Mormons wanted the Mormons to be able to govern themselves. And so the Douglas's opponents would often call out, your popular sovereignty doctrine is going to directly lead to these crazy Mormons governing themselves, which we don't want. And Douglas would admit that no, the Mormons shouldn't be included in this popular sovereignty because they are uncivilized. Only civilized people should be able to govern themselves. And during the Lincoln-Douglas debates, the famed debates when Abraham Lincoln was running for Douglas's Senate seat, Lincoln cornered Douglas and said, well, how do you square your popular sovereignty doctrine with your unwillingness to allow the Mormons to govern themselves? And he responded, well, the Mormons are an ulcer that need to be chopped off the American body. That was seen as a betrayal to the Latter-day Saints. As you might imagine, Brigham Young denounced Stephen A. Douglas, which is what made it all the more ironic when during the Civil War, the United States create a fort, a military presence in Salt Lake City, and they name it Fort Douglas, just a bit of a needle in the side of the Latter-day Saints. As you no doubt assume, the primary reason why these Mormons out in Deseret Territory, which the federal government did not even allow them to create a state of Deseret. They instead created a territory named Utah, named after one of the indigenous groups in the Utah regions. The reason why the federal government did not trust the Mormons was polygamy. Polygamy on the one hand, theocracy on the other. They believed that the Mormons were acting in an uncivilized manner, both in their marital relations, taking on plural wives, but also in their political relations, granting their political authorities, their religious authorities, full political power. Now, polygamy was an open secret up until 1852, when Brigham Young asked Orson Pratt to publicly announce to the world what the world mostly already knew, that the Mormons were practicing polygamy. Now, Mormons made two primary arguments in their quest to gain acceptance for their practice of polygamy. One, they argued that it was their right of popular sovereignty. We have the rights as white American citizens to govern ourselves and operate the way we want. Polygamy is the way of pursuing our own happiness.
The church continues to do this. When the whole gay marriage thing came out, Dallin Oaks, who is a lawyer and served on the Utah Supreme Court, he was the one put in charge of, we cannot let this law pass. And they use this exact same mentality to try to get the government to understand, like, look, you can have all the laws that you want, but the reality is we are a religion. And as a religion, we have the freedom to do and think and act as we please. And so they were able to kind of, through word manipulation, pretend that they supported gays and that they love the LGBTQ community. But the reality is they are still very much against this, but they can use pretty words and convince people. And it's the exact same playbook, people. It's no different.
And second, they argue that polygamy was their sincerely held belief, meaning it was protected under the Constitution and the free exercise of religion clause. Of course, those outside of Utah denounced those types of arguments. And in fact, in 1854 to 1856, when a new political party is created, the Republican Party, the Grand Old Party, it is founded. Its original two planks was the destruction of slavery in the South and polygamy out in the West. This fused their political ideology of that newfound populist party of creating a federal government powerful enough to destroy what they saw as the cultural ills.
I mean, I had no idea when the Republican Party started, but to see the mentality of what the Republicans stood for and then what's happening right now in the party. And it's just absolutely fascinating. And the scary part is, people, this is over 200 years ago, and we're still using the same playbook. It's really frightening. And I also want you to consider other religious leaders who have tried to do the exact same thing that Brigham Young did. I mean, let's look at Jim Jones and the people that followed him and eventually committed suicide under his direction because they said, well, the United States is not recognizing us, and as a religion, we should be able to do whatever we want to. So we will leave the United States so that we can create a theocracy and control the people. And the people said, sounds great. So, I mean, look at this, look at the Ku Klux Klan. It's just a hamster wheel going round and round and round. And it's frightening. Any kind of an inch forward is 2 steps back. I want you to just use this as a preview, and I want you to look at Dr. Benjamin Park, look at his videos, find him on YouTube, because he goes into not only a little history of the Mormons and how they got out to Utah, but how did Brigham Young become the new leader after Joseph Smith was killed? That's extremely interesting. Let me give you a little tidbit here. Brigham Young was, he and his buddy Kimball, they were buddies in Utah as missionaries. And so over 50%, and at one time, 85% of the members of the church, it was like 50% in Nauvoo and later like 85% in Utah, were people from the United Kingdom. And they knew Brigham Young and they believed him because there was a connection there. And so when the succession happened after Joseph Smith was killed, they trusted what Brigham Young was telling them. And there were other people in positions of authority that were like, no, that's not what Joseph Smith wanted. Joseph Smith's succession plan was that all of the leaders in the Mormon church would be related. There would be a patriarchy and a hierarchy that is familial. And so that's why Emma Smith was like, when her husband was killed and Brigham Young was like, sorry, babe, we're going to Utah and you should come too. She was like, that's not what my husband, the prophet, said should happen. And she stayed behind in Illinois. There are so many people that have never been a Mormon. They are historians that cover a lot of different topics of American history. But Mormonism is such a thread in American history. It's more than just the pilgrims that supposedly came to this country for religious freedom. We're not talking about Presbyterianism. We're not talking about the Campbellites. We're not talking about that because they don't have the money or the power that the Mormon Church has. So as an ending, I want to introduce you to a documentary that I found that also talks about the money and the power that the Mormon Church has.
It is the year of 1823. Joseph Smith claims he's received a revelation from God. A new scripture, written in an ancient language, etched into golden plates buried in a New York hillside. But revelations don't print themselves. He needs money to print the books, lots of money. But the problem is, no one wants to bankroll a prophet with no congregation, no credibility, and no cash. That's when Martin Harris steps forward. Harris is a farmer. He's seen Joseph at work. He's heard the words, and he's all in. Against his wife's protests, against his community's ridicule, Harris mortgages his farm, 240 acres of hard-earned land, to secure the $3,000, a fortune in 1830. Even though Martin eventually lost the land, becomes destitute, the books are finally printed. The message spreads, and from that sacrifice, a movement is born. For nearly 200 years, the Mormon Church has been preaching salvation, family, and eternal life. But behind the sermons lies a financial empire few outsiders truly grasp. With hundreds of billions of dollars in investment funds and vast real estate holdings stretching from farmland to Wall Street, this church has become one of the richest religious institutions on earth.
A former investment manager for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints says that the organization stockpiled more than $100 billion in funding intended for charity work, but never spent it on such projects.
To take money out of your hard-earned paycheck so the church can buy more Amazon stock, I think that's a really, really tough equation for people to make.
Find this documentary. It is absolutely fascinating and so well done. And so here's my Mormon Monday. This is the presentation that I have for you today. I hope that it has, if nothing else, spurred you into a freaking rabbit hole. And you are going to be so enthralled and taken over by the knowledge that you had no idea was existing in the Mormon Church. So that is my message. That is my purpose. My purpose is to enlighten you and to make you be more aware of how power, money, and wealth in the LDS Corporation has plans of once again taking over the world, just like when Brigham Young moved out west. That was the plan. This is not just a cute little wonderfully organized blonde organization that is just there to help and serve people. It is everything but that. So thanks for joining me today on She Became Visible. Again, please like, subscribe, share, and push the notification bell if you want to hear more. It's absolutely mind-blowing. And please also stay tuned for Wednesday, where I will be interviewing Tim Kosnoff. If you don't know who he is, Google him. He is absolutely amazing, and I am so excited to interview him. And Megan as a co-host, She has her own story, which is why she is joining me today with Tim. It's going to be absolutely fascinating. So thanks for joining me today. We will see you again on Wednesday. Have a great day. And ladies, stand up and tell the world, I am worth it, I have value, and it is time for myself to be the visible one. Thanks for joining me today. Bye.